from Santa Cruz, the county's #1 Google Slides live stream. We interrupt your regularly scheduled Artemidorus-themed programming this week to celebrate with you, alongside you, the International Week of the Badger. And I want to tell you in this week's talk just a few things that you can know about and also do with, just practically speaking, these fun little furry friends. Now, there has been, have to say this, in classics in the last 20 years or so, a real badger renaissance, real renaissance of badgers. Used to be, we had one word for badger in Latin and we had no word for badger in Greek. And now we have so many words for badger that it's hard even to count them. I think there are 4 total. There are more in Greek, 2 in Latin, a lot in Greek. Well, let's go through these guys item by item, starting with the Greek words. The Greek case is a really wild one because the conventional wisdom up until, as I said, fairly recently, was that the Greeks had just never heard of a badger. They did not know what a badger was. They had not seen badgers. They did not have a word for badger, despite the fact that there were, we are sure, badgers all over the place. In Neolithic sites in Greece, there are badger bones showing markings for skinning and butchering. So people were eating these badgers, but by the time that the Greek language rolled around to its classical phase, the claim was, the Greeks just didn't have a word for badger. Well, like I said, now we've got a bunch. We're finding them all over the place. You got, for example, Trachos. Trachos, showing up in De Generatione Animalium, on the Generation of Animals by Aristotle, a book about how animals make more animals by generating. Trachos, a word that's a little bit difficult to understand why it applies to badger, but people are now fairly sure that it does mean badger in this context. And Aristotle settling a a kind of myth that exists about how badgers are hermaphrodites. He says, you can check out badgers near you. They're not hermaphrodites. The reason one might get confused about this with badgers is something that we'll go into a little bit later. They have very complicated nether regions, including what appears to be, on both male and female badgers, a false vagina. So this leads to the story that Aristotle is discrediting in De Generatione Animalium. It's part of a passage where he sort of claims that there are not really whole species of mammals that are hermaphroditic, although there are individual hermaphroditic mammals and hermaphroditic species outside of the quadrupeds. Other words in Greek that you have, you've also got archomys, you've got archalos, and you've got archos, a word that is fairly recently discovered to mean badger on the basis of other Indo-European cognates, one particularly in Tocharian, the werk. People now think this word means badger. Before, people just thought it was like a misspelling of bear, arctos, like that idiots would make. But now people are beginning to come around to the idea that in a lot of places where it occurs, archos means badger. So this helps make sense, actually, of a slightly weird passage in Lucian's Alexander the False Prophet. As some of you know about my favorite book from the ancient world, the story of a snake with hair, and how that snake with hair came to be worshipped as a god across the Roman world. Well, the guy who is the boss of the snake with hair is named Alexander. He's the aforementioned Alexander. And he also has a sideline in snake oil, not actually oil from the snake, it's a metaphor. And he makes this kind of ointment, which he sells all over the place, doing some real like Alex Jones supplement stuff. And it is it has an archaeon lipon in it, an archaeon lipon in it, which people had read as like a misspelling of archaeon lipon, meaning bear's grease, but actually now we think it's badger grease, which makes a lot of sense because the medicinal properties of the badger have long been understood and admired. Moving over to the Latin side, well, you got meles, which is just like the basic word for the animal. The etymology is still not well understood, so something that one can do research on. Not really mentioned all that often in Latin literature. So I've said there are a few mentions in Greek literature, but it does not show up all that much. It's not an animal that people talk about. There's this one poem by Martial, the Roman epigrammatist, where he's like, "Hey, why are you living in Rome instead of going out to the countryside? You're hunting slaves, just catch badgers and stuff, and then you have to eat the badgers." The suggestion being both that badgers are not good to eat, and that badgers are not really that challenging to hunt by comparison with leopards or lions or bears or whatever. Badgers are kind of small game. By the way, it seems like badgers are actually maybe good to eat. It's just hard to find a cuisine that will cook them. Slavic cuisines seem to be into it if you're looking to try them. So this animal has another side, kind of. Pliny the Elder talks about it. Apparently, it inflates itself like some kind of horrible balloon animal or four-footed pufferfish, so that hunters cannot pierce it with a spear and dogs cannot pierce it with the teeth. If you see a badger doing that, I would love to have a picture. Well, that's one word, and then you've got this other one, taxo. It's a late Latin word. It's thought to be a borrowing from Germanic. For a long time, people thought this word was borrowed from Germanic. It shows up in Germanic in the noble dachshund, the badger dog, whose ridiculous hot dog shape is so that it can get down into those badger sets and eat a badger or two. Looking at the evidence more in depth, it's a little harder to figure out where this word came from, because apparently it's also in Celtic. It shows up in Hittite. It shows up in the Indo-Iranian languages in Sanskrit. So maybe it's just a word that sort of wanders around, a so-called Wanderwort, a word whose origin is impossible to trace, or maybe it goes back to Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European, after all, and Latin just always had two words for badger, which is not unheard of when it comes to animals. The funny thing about taxo is that the root, tasku, from which it comes, is not only used with reference to animals, and this comes back to what I was saying before about the badger's complicated and strange nether region structure. In Hittite, it seems like tasku means something like not badger, but like an anus, perhaps, or a perineal region, something like that. Because badgers do have, like I said, complicated nether zones. They secrete a lot of musk-type compounds, a couple of different, very strong smelling musk compounds, so they are noticeable for their weird rears. So in Hittite, it seems like this word is one that also refers to something in the zone of the anus. And then strangely, it's also like a proper name for people in Hittite, so people are just walking around being called Mr. Anus. Well, Hittite culture is little understood. Maybe it was a compliment. Well, speaking of the badger's kind of weird rear end, in a lot of parts of the world, this grants the badger a certain kind of special status among animals. Its ability to secrete musk, either as a source of perfume or because it's thought to be somehow magical. And this seems to be the case kind of in the Celtic regions, where badger is also seems much more ritually privileged than elsewhere in the Indo-European world. And if we're talking about the magical properties of badgers, then I really got to get moving on to the critical take-home lesson of this talk. And that comes from this thing called the Epistola de Bestiola quam aliqui melem vocant quidam vero taxonem. A little letter about the little beast, which some people call a badger and other people call a badger. Melis taxonis. This letter supposedly is from the king of Egypt to Augustus Caesar. Now, if you ever see an inscription or a signature on a letter like this, it is fake, and I'm going to have to suggest that you forwarded it on to the Communications Technology Office so they can flag it as spam. The king of Egypt does not send letters to anyone. Certainly not you, certainly not Caesar Augustus. But the letter does contain a lot of really good and useful advice about badgers. Well, the first thing, of course, is to catch one, and for that you just get a dachshund of your own or something. Then once you've caught it, you take it apart, you take the skin off, you take all the organs out. Before you throw all the junk away, you should melt some of it because badger grease is very good for headaches. You just rub it on your temples. Headache will go right away. But all the other parts of the badger body have uses of their own, and I'm only going to have room to go through a few of them here. You can make, for instance, little booties for your dachshund out of the badger hide, and this will protect your dog from various dog misfortunes. If you've got an army, anoint your troops with some badger grease. The most important thing, though, is that you have to save the brain, save the badger's brain. Then you take that and you bury it underneath your door frame, underneath the front door of your house. You don't need to ask your landlord about this. They will be cool with it because the badger's brain is a surefire plague blocker. So you put that badger brain under your door frame, and your landlord's going to be so grateful because your house is going to be coronavirus free. I wonder actually if I'm going to get kicked off of YouTube for violating terms of service in giving this extremely good anti-coronavirus advice. Maybe this is the video that will finally get my channel canceled, despite my many violations of Peppa Pig copyrights. Well, if I'm not canceled, I'll see everyone here next week. In the meantime, have a great weekend. Stay healthy and safe.